Hi there, and welcome to Let's Talk About Digital Wellness, Understanding Your Child's Emotions and Mental Health. I'm Lisa Solomon, and I work with our Connected Schools members across the country. And we are so grateful for the partnerships and support that so many of you give to our nonprofit, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year. The schools many of you are affiliated with and their participation in our Connected Schools program allows us to continue to provide educators and families with so many free resources, from media ratings and reviews to research to our award-winning K-12 digital citizen curriculum. We're focusing on digital wellness today, as it's the center of Common Sense's new Healthy Young Minds campaign. This is a multi-year initiative focusing on building public understanding about the youth mental health crisis in our country, which we're seeing so much about today in the news and just everywhere. There's a lot being written and talked about. This campaign will also spotlight solutions and create momentum for industry and policy change. Common Sense is also involved with Dove's National Self-Esteem Project and supports the U.S. Surgeon General's call to make social media safer for all kids. I'll soon share some of those details in the chat if you want to learn more. But let's get to today. The goal of this webinar is to support you, parents out on the front lines, as you help your kids manage our tech-saturated world. We'll focus on mental health today, but I want to share a very quick disclaimer that this content is for educational purposes only and doesn't substitute for professional medical advice or for consultation with healthcare professionals specific to your family's needs. Just a few more quick housekeeping items, and then we'll get to the content. This session is being recorded and will run for about an hour. We're going to do our best to answer your questions along the way, but know that our team has read all of the great questions submitted ahead of time, and we've threaded many of those into our prep work. If you are joining us live, please share comments and new questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring those in real time and also sharing Common Sense tips and resources for you to use. We're going to start this conversation by having our panelists, Lisa Damour and Cara Natterson, talk with Common Sense's Director of Research, Dr. Supreet Mann. Dr. Mann, among so many other things, was instrumental in investigating how social media impacts the mental health of teenage girls. And those findings were recently released in a new Common Sense report called Teens and Mental Health: How Girls Really Feel About Social Media. Even though this specific research focused on girls, we are by no means leaving out boys and all gender identities in today's conversation. Lisa and Cara's upcoming guidance will address digital wellness for all of our children. So now I'm going to introduce Lisa Damour and Cara Natterson, and then Dr. Mann will join in. I am so delighted to introduce Dr. Lisa Damour. She is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Untangled, Under Pressure, and her latest, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, works in collaboration with UNICEF, and is recognized as a thought leader to the American Psychological Association. Dr. Damour is also a regular contributor to the New York Times and CBS News. Next up is Dr. Cara Natterson. She's a pediatrician, New York Times bestselling author, and co-founder and CEO of Order of Magnitude. It's a company designed to make puberty more comfortable, literally, with content and products. She also co-hosts the Puberty Podcast, which updates adults on how this transformative stage has changed. And she has a TikTok channel you can find at Spilling the Puberty. And I'll put those in the chat as well. So Dr. Mann, I'm now going to hand the conversation over to you to give us the top line findings from Common Sense's most recent research report, How Girls Really Feel About Social Media, and then Cara and Lisa will join in as well. Thank you so much. Over to you, Supreet.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to share some of our findings from our recent report and then chat with Lisa and Cara about some of those findings. So I'd like to first share a brief overview of what we learned in our study so our conversation can be as helpful to parents as possible. This most recent study surveyed over 1,300 adolescent girls ages 11 to 15 to better understand their perceptions of social media platforms that they use and features that are universal across these platforms. And we know from the study that social media plays a huge role in the lives of adolescents. Our report highlights just how complicated this relationship can be. We found that social media use is nearly universal among girls, with 98% of our sample having ever used at least one platform. And YouTube and TikTok are the two platforms that emerge as being the most popular among teen girls. They spend over 2 hours a day on these two platforms and about 90 minutes a day on other platforms like Instagram and Snapchat. Our study also reveals that while some platforms present more pitfalls than others, it's often the features that are universal across platforms that seem to influence girls' experiences with social media the most. So when we started out with this research, we thought we would uncover some major differences by platform when it came to supporting mental health. And while girls overwhelmingly report that YouTube is a mostly positive platform, TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat are fairly similar in perception, meaning that girls are not much more likely to report one as being more or less positive than the others. We also asked girls to rate their perception of 12 different features that are common across these different social media platforms. Things like location sharing, metrics like comments and likes. And girls were often split on whether these features were positive and negative, but location sharing and public accounts were the two features that girls said had the most negative impact, while video recommendations and positive messaging had a mostly positive impact on them. And understanding how different features can shape girls' well-being is really important for girls who are the most vulnerable. We also assessed depressive symptomatology and looked at differences between girls who reported no depressive symptoms versus those who measured mild or moderate to severe in depressive symptoms. And our findings suggest that for girls with moderate to severe depressive symptoms, both the good and the bad of social media is amplified. Girls with moderate to severe depressive symptoms were more likely to report overuse of social media, feeling addicted to different platforms, and they were more likely to say that platforms interfere with their sleep. They're also much more likely to compare themselves with their life to others, both in real life and on social media platforms. But on the flip side, the findings also suggest that for these girls with depressive symptoms, they may be more likely to form connections with others on social media or to help with identity engagement, suggesting that social media might be really helpful for some of these girls.
Supreet, it's Cara. I'm going to jump in here with a question for you. I wonder, some of us are listening to the research you're presenting, and we're wondering, what's new, right? We've heard over and over again that kids are unhappy, and some of that, much of that has been tethered to social media. So can you share with us, what does the research add? Why did Common Sense even want to pursue it in the first place?
Sure, absolutely. So Common Sense has been conducting research on social media since 2011, way before we were really thinking about its impacts in this nuanced way. And this new report gives us an up-to-date, comprehensive roadmap to teen girls' online lives. It helps us better understand what they're doing, where they go, and how all of this makes them feel. We're able to look at the features that they love, the features that they hate, what they wish could be different, etc. And this report reinforces what we found over and over again as we've undertaken this type of research. We keep finding that teens who are already at risk or experiencing mental health challenges are more likely to be at risk for the negative impacts from social media. But these same teens are also more likely to find the benefits of social media, like finding resources or community and support. So overall, they have positive perceptions of social media, saying their lives would be either the same or worse in some cases if these platforms didn't exist. But at the same time, we need to remember that they are also reporting feeling strong pulls from social media. Girls report feelings of addiction or a need to be responsive to peers and interference with sleep as some of the negative pressures that they feel on social media platforms.
Supreet, thank you so much for these findings. I want to get sort of more specific and just keep drilling down. In terms of the negative feelings that the girls were reporting, what were they saying? Like, what were some of the more kind of fine-grained results in your study?
Yeah, so like I said, no one platform emerged as being that much more negative than another, but there were certain platforms that were more likely to lead to certain types of negative experiences. So for each platform that girls had used, we asked them to report how often they felt that they were addicted to the platform. And TikTok users were the most likely to say that they feel addicted to the platform. About 45% of TikTok users said they feel addicted. That number was lower for Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube users. It was closer to 33%. TikTok was also the platform that girls were most likely to report disrupts their sleep, again, followed by Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube. And when it comes to the pressures that are associated with availability, so being responsive to peers, for example, Snapchat users were the most likely to report those pressures. And going back to then those individual features that we looked at, those 12 separate features, the features that girls cited as being negative or problematic, 6 out of 10 girls who used Instagram or Snapchat said they've ever had unwanted contact with a stranger on those platforms.
For the kids who are vulnerable, right? The ones who are struggling socially. What did you learn about both the positive and negative roles that social media played in these girls' lives?
Yeah, so one of our major goals in this report was to really look at these socially vulnerable girls with depressive symptomatology. And what we found was that roughly 1 in 5 girls in our sample reported daily experiences of bullying, drama, or feeling left out in the real world, so outside of social media. And we define these as girls who are struggling socially. And for those girls, they're 3 to 4 times as likely as other girls to report having daily negative social experiences online. But again, like we saw with girls with depressive symptomatology, they might also be more likely to reap the benefits of the digital world. So, and again, like what I said before, when it comes to depression, those challenges are similar. Girls with moderate to severe depressive symptoms were more likely than girls without depressive symptoms to say that YouTube, Instagram, and messaging apps have had a mostly negative impact on people their age. They were also more likely to say that their lives would be better without those platforms. But at the same time, girls with mild depressive symptoms were also more likely to say their lives would be worse without YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, and messaging apps. So suggesting that for these socially vulnerable girls, the good is amplified, the bad is amplified, but there's definitely some space that we need to consider.
Supreet, thank you. Thank you. That's a lot of data for us to dig into. We are so grateful for your laying it all out and helping us get started in this conversation.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right, Lisa.
All right, Cara. Let's dig in.
Uh-oh, we have no more Supreet to give us the data. So here we go. Our hope in this conversation is really to separate the signal and the noise, right? Because the volume is so high on teen mental health right now. And it's really tricky for any adult who's touching the lives of any kid or kids who fit the puberty or adolescent definition, right? Probably anywhere from about 8 to about 18. All of those adults feel a little bit like their hair's on fire. So you and I talked about how we're going to break this conversation down. And I'm a big fan of telling everyone what they're going to hear so that they can anticipate the conversation, right? So here we go. We're going to break it into 3 buckets. We're going to talk about the national conversation around youth mental health. Then we're going to move on to the common sense research that Supreet just presented and talk about the implications for social media use. And then you and I are going to give our own advice where we leave on our professional hats, but we also put our parent hats on and talk about what it's like in our own homes a little bit. So I want to start with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So this was a study that was published back in the winter. It got a ton of press. It is a study that's done every 2 years by the CDC. And the findings that were reported was that nearly 60% of adolescent girls felt sad for at least 2 weeks during the previous year, okay? And I should take a pause and say that data was collected between September and December of 2021. So I just want to contextualize it a little bit. I know you're going to get into this in your answer, but when we look at that 60%, that's an overwhelming number, okay? 1 in 3 girls reported considering taking their own lives. Now, you and I have talked a lot about the data and how terrifying it is, and the generalization of depression. Can you begin to share with us how we can process it all. How can we think about that data that was presented? Where is it valid? Where there may be some holes to think about?
I'm so glad we're starting here because this report, I think it came out on February 13th, and it's still in the headlines, and it was alarming, extremely concerning. And I think, you really put your finger on it. One of the things that got lost in a lot of the headlines was when the data were actually collected. So it was in the fall of 2021, and it asked about mood over the previous year, and it asked about whether there had been a period of low mood for at least 2 weeks in the previous year. And what I can tell you is that these alarming findings mapped onto what we were seeing clinically. There were no surprises if you put it in that time frame. And I actually had to go back and look at some of the writing I had done in the fall of 2021 to really try to wrap my head around, like, where were teenagers at that moment? And what I found, because I think for a lot of people, the pandemic started to feel like a blur. But in that particular moment, when these data were collected, kids were entering their third school year disrupted by the pandemic. And the form that it took was very different depending on the kid. Some kids were going back to school in person and were not wearing masks, and some kids were very frightened about that. Some kids were going back to school in person and were wearing masks, and they were really anxious about how that was going to play out socially. Some kids were still hybrid and online and extremely unhappy about that. So what I was hearing from teenagers and what we were watching is that even, for all kids, they were deeply frustrated at that time. And even for the kids who actually were having an experience that they thought was good, and I had forgotten this until I went to my notes, what they were telling me was that they were sure it was all about to be taken away. So they were starting to lean back into things being more typical, and they didn't trust it, and they were anxious. So it was a really, really hard time when those data were collected. Now, of course, the question is, what are we seeing now, right? How do those translate to where we are now? Anecdotally, and Cara, this is what I've seen, and I want you to weigh in on this. As school normalized, as kids were able to return and find their feet a bit in their social and their academic lives, a lot of kids are feeling better. That doesn't mean that there aren't kids who don't continue to suffer. We see a lot of that, and certainly kids suffered mightily in the pandemic. But I do think it's important to contextualize those data and not to go with the assumption, which one could easily make based on how a lot of these data were reported, that these are brand new, telling us a snapshot of where we sit right now. So I think that that's really, really key. Okay, so then Cara, for you, I think that one of the things we want to think about together is, okay, so now we're in the here and now. We've put those data in context. We now have our own children, right, in our homes that we're trying to guide along in terms of how they manage their devices. I think before the pandemic, it was easier to demonize devices. I think in the pandemic, it was basically what kept everyone going, either in terms of entertainment or distraction or being able to connect with people. How do we hit the reset button? What do we suggest now in terms of the kinds of rules that families might make around devices?
So I'm going to pick up on one point that you just left off on before I answer. You know how I do that, Lisa, all the time in our conversations. You talked about what your perception is of how kids are doing now, and you talk about it from the perspective of being a mental health expert. I will share that I agree with you from the perspective of being a pediatrician who talks to kids who are living through puberty all day, every day. It is not that I think we are through the mental health crisis by any means, but I think that the CDC data was collected at a particularly low point, and the data was presented as if we were looking at a continuum, like a trajectory, and the next data point when they collect their next round, which is they collect every 2 years, so it will be this fall that they collect their next data. The sort of implication is it's only getting worse, and I do feel that from September, October, November, December of 2021, when my kids in LA had been out of school for months and months and months, and it was very, very difficult for the kids who were in states where everything was hybrid. Your kids too, Lisa. I think we have to contextualize what we saw then. We will see that in the report of the next youth risk behavior survey, which will probably come out in early, I'm guessing, 2025 if things stay on track, but we'll see. Okay, so now to your question, which is, how can we find balance, right? And how can we figure out how to manage all of this when the world is shifting before us, and the data is a little bit alarming, but you and I both know that there's sort of a big spectrum of experiences among kids and frankly among families and educators as well. So my mantra is that balance is the goal. I do believe it's achievable. I don't think that you can enforce one set of rules when kids are a certain age and then hold tight to those rules forever and ever and ever, and not expect to shift and change and grow those rules as a child matures. But that is the beauty of kind of living with and learning about the kids in your lives. So I would give three sort of points of advice here. The first being limit as long as possible. Now, that used to mean, if this is the parenting piece of it, used to mean don't give your child a cell phone as long as you can. I think now the advice is different. It's limit the logins that they have, because it doesn't really matter if it's their device or your device. If they have logins and access to platforms, that is access. And then the other is, when you do give them devices, there are ways to baby step it. So some parents use a flip phone. Some parents, I'll tell you what I did in my house is the first smartphone was really dumb. It had text. The people who were available to text were very limited. There was no internet on that phone. There were no other apps on that phone. And there was a sort of a slow maturing into getting other sort of apps and functionality on a smartphone over time. And that works really well for a lot of families and a lot of kids. No device in the bedroom. That's another really easy, really big picture piece of advice. In the pandemic, that was impossible, right? I mean, everyone was out in their own space trying to carve out a little private area where they could do school or do their homework. And I think it got people into habits. It sort of exacerbated habits that were already there and made them worse. So do your very best. And frankly, for any adult who's watching this, the same is true for you. Do your best to keep devices in non-bedroom spaces, use them in non-bedroom spaces, and then in bedroom spaces, off if possible. Now, that's a little tricky as kids get older, and we can talk about that, Lisa, if you want. But certainly for overnight, the data is very clear that none of us, not one of us, it doesn't matter our age, should not be sleeping with devices in the room. Finally, I'm a big fan of turning off notifications. I mean, I see what they do to me. I know what they do to my kids. It feeds this monster of FOMO, right? Because you're constantly hearing that something is going on. And this includes news notifications. It's not just social media notifications or text notifications. So as many notifications as you can turn off, it's a win. So that is where I would start with finding balance.
Amen to all of that. I'm going to come in and just sort of underline, highlight some of the fabulous things you said. Okay, so starting with the least amount of technology your kid really needs to stay connected, right? Because I think the question is when should kids have phone? Well, when they need to be in some kind of communication with somebody. And so parents might decide, the kid's taking the bus. I want the kid to have a phone. Fine, that's great. How much communication power does the kid need for that bus and that phone to do what you need it to do? And like you said, usually it's texting, calling, goes very far. And one of the things I think about in terms of giving kids, I did the same thing in my house, right? Here's a phone. It has no browser. It has no apps. It is a texting machine. I also control whether it ever gets a browser, what apps it ever gets. I'm always interested in sort of the inflection point for kids, right? Social media is very tricky, as Common Sense Media has done an incredible job of laying out. Social isolation is bad for kids too. So I'm always interested, how long can they get on texting before we need to look at other options for them staying socially connected? If they are still socially connected with texting alone, I think you can make the case that texting is working great. The piece about no device in the bedroom, This, I could not agree more. We have studies showing that none of us even sleep as well when there's a device in the room. And the way that we understand this research is that we are all so Pavlovianly attached to our phones that if our phone is proximal to us, we're using a degree of our energy to not engage it. And that even while sleeping, we are deploying energy to not engage the phone. So it undermines the quality of the sleep we're getting. The key for me is to try to set it up this way. And so I really hope we have a lot of families with younger kids on this call or kids who don't yet have phones joining us tonight. Because the thing that is the most true about kids and technology is that at the moment that a teenager or a tween or a kid is asking for a phone, they will agree to anything. They really, really want that device. So that is your golden moment. That is the most leverage you will ever have. And that's a great time to say, okay, you can get this. For now, it just texts. And then this thing, it never crosses the threshold of your bedroom. And it certainly is never there at night, but ideally never during the 24-hour day if you can help it. Kids will say yes. And then you walk back from those positions. The other thing I'll say is start with texting, see how it goes. If your kid texts responsibly, engages with a nice group of buddies in a kind way, social media, when the time comes, doesn't seem like a terrible idea. If with texting alone, your kid gets involved in the meanest text chain ever, that is a really good sign that your kid is not yet ready for social media. So go slow, give it over in bits. I think that especially early days with phones and kids, I watch a lot of parents, I bet, Cara, you watch a lot of parents say, okay, we're giving you a phone. And then they would hand over the phone fully loaded and with no restrictions on where it went and how it was used.
I'm going to make you laugh to your point that they will agree to anything. So I had a rule when my kids got phones. We actually there was like a little contract that was going around. And so I printed it up and I added Rule 17. My kids still talk about it. One of my kids is in college. They still talk about it. Rule 17, no phone in the bathroom.
I should have added that rule. I actually printed out the Common Sense Media contract. Maybe Common Sense Media should put that on there.
I love it. So they will agree. 100% they will agree to anything. And your point about texting meanness is actually really, really important. And I think we should go there for 1 second. When kids are in grade school, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and they are typically on the adult's device, even, they're not even on their own device. What happens in every school across this country, Lisa, with respect to text?
Not good things. Not good things.
It's a mess. And you have to be there, part of it, moderating, giving them the teachable moments and the tools. But if they cannot handle text, right, forget it. It's like, I'm not giving my 14-year-old the keys to my car, right? Or as a psychiatrist friend of mine said, it's like, you board the plane and you let your teenager go fly it. I don't think so, right? So these are all reminders to parents that there are ways to scaffold and to baby step the decision. However, Lisa, you and I, when we are parents, take off our professional hat and we put on our parenting hat and we forget everything we tell everyone. And we step in it just as much as other parents do. And we make mistakes as much as every other parent does. And sometimes we will even follow the advice that other people give us. And it turns out to be the wrong advice for us, right? Because every family is different and every kid's needs are different. And so there have been plenty of times in my home, and certainly plenty of times in many of my friends' homes, when they give something, a device, an app, access to a platform, and then they really, really regret it. So can we talk for a second about the power of taking a do-over as a parent and why it's so important to feel like just because you gave it, it doesn't mean you can't take it away?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because we have that same approach in other aspects of raising kids, that if you have a teenager who goes out on a Saturday night and acts in a way that is completely out of control, even long before digital technology, we would say, all right, you're grounded for a while. Like, you can't go out. You're showing us that you're not actually able to handle this well. We'll try this again later. So the idea that you loosen the reins, you give kids a chance to try to sort it out, and sometimes they get it right and sometimes they don't. But that doesn't mean that it's a one-way street. So it's okay. You had that freedom, you had that app, you used it in a way that was not in line with what we're in agreement about. We're going to walk it back and then think about it for a while. And then we can see when it makes sense to try to do it again. So you absolutely can go back and forth. And I think we do this in all aspects of parenting. And I think we just should try to do it with social media, just to say, show me you handle this really well, and then you can have more freedom. If you're showing me that you're not really ready to handle this, what kind of parent am I if I let you kind of run wild with it then?
I mean, right. So I think this is a good segue then into mental health, right? Because the running wild can, in many cases, for, again, any of us of any age, lead to that fabulous phenomenon of doom scrolling, right? And doom scrolling is sort of a catchy term that, I think is a little biased, but I use it because really what it does is it is a constant search for comparisons that lead to lower self-esteem. So can you talk a little bit about what happens when sort of the mental health issues and these devices, and in particular social media, intersect?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know me well, Cara, and I tend not to be alarmist, and I tend not to say something's on fire. But when I look at the social media landscape, probably for me, the thing I'm most anxious about are the algorithms. And I think it's two things. One, how the algorithms work, and the other, I don't really know that we talk about them in ways that really shine a light on how powerful they are. So let me just take a minute to nerd out a little bit on the math behind the algorithms, because one of the things about being a psychologist is you have to take just tons of statistics classes. And when I think about the math behind the algorithms, my heart rate goes up, and that doesn't happen a whole lot. So here's the deal on the algorithms. Algorithms are these wildly powerful equations, and they are designed to predict something. The way that we think about them from a mathematics perspective is that the thing they're predicting, we call that the dependent variable. And in the universe of social media, the dependent variable is, what can we put in front of you next that you're not going to be able to stop looking at? What's the image, the reel, the TikTok that you're just going to not be able to pull away from? And then on the other side of the equation are the independent variables, all of these other things that can be measured. Now, on the independent variable side of the equation, there are tons and tons of things that are being measured. What did you look at last? When you looked at that thing, how long did you look at that thing? Did you zip right past it, or did you rest on it? Did you rest on this thing for a nanosecond more than you rested on this other thing? When we've showed you similar things like this, what's your interest been? People in your demographic, what do they tend to like to look at next? When we showed you this thing that was like really outlandish, very different from what you typically like, did you like it? Did you not like it? So those are all of the variables that are being measured. And the force of an equation these are regression equations is what we call them. The force of a regression equation, the power of it, is determined by how many independent variables you can load onto one side of the equation and how much data is informing each of those variables. So for all of us and our kids with social media, there are tons and tons and tons of independent variables, because everything we've ever done in the past on our social media is informing the independent variable side of the equation. And so the quality of the prediction is actually staggering, right? They have so much information about what's going to be hard to look away from. So as Supreet was running through the data description, and the word addicted kept coming up. So when psychologists think about addicted and the use of the term addiction, for me, I always translated that in my mind to meaning like can't stop, just cannot stop, like want to stop and can't stop. And so when kids are saying they feel addicted to their social media, what I think is almost always happening is the algorithms have figured that kid out and know exactly what to put in front of them out of the billions of options available, that kid, based on this past history that is incredibly well recorded, highly specific, thousands and thousands of data points, based on that past history, what's the next thing that we're going to show you that you're just going to have to watch? And so I think it's so critical that we understand and that we help kids understand the sheer mathematical force of what they're up against, because I think we don't always understand that math. And that math to me, that kind of keeps me up at night.
And that word addiction, it really grabbed me as well. In the pediatric world, when we hear addiction, here's what we're thinking. So an addiction happens because the brain is releasing dopamine. We call it a dopamine hit often, and it feels really good. And it's human nature to seek another dopamine hit when one comes, and then you want another, and then you want another. In a fully mature adult brain, there is the pathways are certainly flexible and malleable, and addiction can certainly happen. And we've all become digital users and become addicted to our phones in many of the same ways our kids have, but with mature brains that are a little bit more resilient to this. Whereas in maturing brains, so the brains of young kids, tweens, teens, and 20-somethings, because their brains aren't going to fully mature until the late 20s, what's happening is that the pathways in their brains are very, very flexible. They're very plastic, and they get very, very entrenched. And those algorithms that you described are serving up images or music or content of any sort that appeals to that kid. And it's like, when you walk through snow after a first snowfall, and the snow is piled pretty high, and it's hard to trudge through the snow the first time. And then the second time it's easier. And the third time it's really easy. And the 15th time, it's like you're flying through this path because you have patted it down and made it easy. That is what happens in a brain as a signal becomes entrenched and as a pathway starts firing regularly. And that, I think that is a good visual for what that addictive feeling looks like in a kid's brain. So I think you and I respond to that word very similarly, and it struck both of us, I think, in very similar ways. And of course, social media is everywhere all at once, right? It's like
True.
you can't get away from it.
It's true. And so, I also always want to be so careful, both about like laying out the stuff that makes us anxious and what we know from the neurological standpoint, but also when to worry about this. And one of the things that I love about the language that teenagers use is they'll often talk about like TikToks having various sides, right? There's different sides of TikTok. And what they're describing is what algorithm shapes your TikTok.
Right.
And so, there's the goofy dance video side of TikTok, and there's the cat video side of TikTok, and there's the, gay books side of TikTok. And then there is the white supremacy side of TikTok. And then there is the like unalloyed misogyny side of TikTok. I mean, there's all of these different sides. And so if the thing that is giving your kid the dopamine hit is cat videos, okay, that's probably like, that's not going to keep me up at night. If the thing that is giving your kid the dopamine hit is something that is offensive or destructive or dangerous or, any variety of, kind of harrowing concerns, then it's time to worry. So for me, the algorithms, they are what they are. They actually also shape all of our social media, and so if what is being served up doesn't really seem that dangerous, I don't want parents to feel like they have to be on the ceiling about it. What really concerns me is the combination of the algorithm and then a destructive norm. And one of the things that I feel is really key about the algorithms is they create a norm for teenagers. They set the environment that a teenager is going to have on their social media. They shape that environment. And the thing about teenagers is they're vulnerable to norms. They're more vulnerable to norms than kids are, than adults are. And so if the norm is, literature, okay. If the norm is terrible things about, minorities or women or, people who are marginalized in our society, not okay. And what we are seeing, and I'm seeing it clinically, is that those norms actually do start to shape not just mood, but also real world behavior. So in terms of what to worry about, it's not just the algorithms, it's really the algorithms and what algorithm your kid's universe is being shaped by.
That's right. But because you and I are so synchronous in the way we think about things, I'm going to share another piece of a conversation that we've had so many times, which is those cat videos. They begin the conversation about the positive side. Those cat videos are very neutral to me, but there are a lot of really positive things that come out of social connection. And we know this. The data is very, very clear on that front too. So there are skills that can be learned. There are, I have a friend who lives down the street who has learned to be an unbelievable chef because his TikTok is all cooking videos, right? You talked about marginalized groups being bullied online, but marginalized groups also find each other online and they build connection and they have mutual support, and then they can rise up and they have voice. So I think in the context of this conversation, and especially with the data that Supreet presented at the top, it's really important for us to remind everyone who's watching that we are not demonizing devices or social media. In fact, quite the opposite. What this common sense media data showed, and what we have seen clinically, is that there's a whole spectrum of experience here, and we have to be very aware of the dangerous end of the spectrum, but it doesn't mean that we can't honor and celebrate the positive end of the spectrum. Okay.
And I agree wholeheartedly. And, we have the data to show it.
That's right.
Since media has the data to show, we've seen this consistently, that it could be such an incredibly powerful force for good. And it's interesting, Cara, years ago, I wrote a piece about kids and anti-racism, and I was interviewing a bunch of kids about their anti-racist work. And 2-1, they told me that where they learned to engage most usefully in anti-racist discourse was through their online environments, where they were watching people post, where they were watching people comment on the comments. And so to the degree that those of us with teenagers are routinely educated by our own teenagers about how to be more broad-minded and more thoughtful and more careful in our, how we take the world in and how we approach the world, they're learning that not in class, not from adults. They're learning it from one another, and they're learning it online.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so with all that good stuff, you and I also still know that sometimes it's time to worry. Worry. So putting our psychologist and pediatrician hats back on, right?
Yes.
In your house or in your work as a pediatrician, when do you say that a line has been crossed and something needs to be done?
Oh, it's such a good question, Lisa. And I think the most important piece of this is that the answer really changes. It changes from day to day, from week to week, from month to month. It really depends upon the circumstance. I have found, as a parent who's trying to learn all of these platforms as my kids master them very, very quickly, that the hardest piece for me is I really don't have visibility into what goes on. And the older my kids are older teenagers now, so they have a lot of independence on these platforms. But the older they get, the more I'm trying to find my own balance between being a voyeur and being overly involved, but also understanding and knowing when to worry. And these, for me, that's the push and pull, right? So what's something that I can look at objectively? It's not what they're doing on their device past a certain point. For parents of younger kids, you should be monitoring what they're doing on their device. I mean, I feel very strongly about that. And at least if you disagree, tell me, but I don't think you disagree with that one. But the newbies on the devices really need a lot of hand-holding. And it's not like you just let go of their hand when they have had a device for a year. It's a very slow extrication where, they start with a device, you add in an app or a platform, you watch them, they mess it up, you take it away, you give it back, you watch them again, they do okay, right? There's a whole sort of graduated thing that happens. And that takes generally several years. But by the time they're older teenagers, they're kind of off on their own, navigating these platforms on their own. So the objective things that I look for are the same things I would look for without a device. So I look for, are kids maintaining friendships? Are they staying connected to people in real life? Or, what we saw in the pandemic is in meaningful ways online. Are kids engaging in a way that makes it clear that even if they have good days or bad days, I'm not worried about their mood or their affect. One thing that you write about in your book so beautifully, and this, everything that you speak about is so accessible, but this particular point to me is one of your most, is that the goal of having a mental health or mental wellness is not having bad days. It's being able to ride the lows and then crest to the highs and do it with the support systems you have around you and get through it, right? It's not to always be happy. It's to figure out how to manage the times that you're not happy. So that's what I'm looking for. Lisa, what are you looking for?
So yes, amen to all of that. And especially about, watching kids when they're younger with their social media. I think, I'm always so aware of like things that get flattened. And I would say, social media gets flattened, right? It's highly complex. That's why we're having this conversation. Screens gets flattened, right? There's a lot that happens on screens, and teenagers gets flattened. And I think it is very, very different. 17 and 18-year-olds on social media versus 12, 13, 14-year-olds on social media. So I agree wholeheartedly that it changes pretty dramatically over time. I'm just going to say the same things you said. I'm just going to say them in a slightly different frame, which is, for me, the goal is not to be against digital technology. You're going to lose that one. It's to be for things that are essential for healthy development. So the kinds of things to be for, and this is just reiterating what Cara said, good, solid relationships, especially with in-person interactions. Getting lots and lots of sleep. Teenagers, high schoolers need 9 hours, middle schoolers need 10, elementary school kids need 11, way more than anybody's getting usually. And I can tell you the link between mental health and sleep is unbelievably strong. It's the thing that we can point to with the most confidence as a key factor in mental health. Being useful around the house, in one's community, being physically active, and then studying with focus. So those are a few things. Like, those should be protected. Digital technology in any form should not actually undermine, social interactions, sleeping, making oneself useful, working with focus, being a physically active person. And to the degree that digital technology in any form starts to get in the way of those things, then the digital technology needs to be reined in.
Okay. Before we move on to a couple of questions that were sent in, I want to give one fun fact about sleep, because it can be a battle. I completely agree with you, of course, how important sleep is. And by the way, adults need more sleep than they get as well. They typically need 8 or 9 hours. So work on that, adults. But here's a fun fact. If you want to convince a younger kid to get in bed on their own, explain to them that they grow when they sleep.
I like that.
They're motivated. Okay. So I'd love to get to a couple of questions that came in prior to this conversation. The first one is about influencers and girl body image. The question was, how do I help my 11-year-old daughter understand that she doesn't need an involved skincare routine or eyelash extensions, really, since she sees all this stuff on TikTok?
Whew, it's hard. And 11 is hard because 11 is young. And if we just go at this from the straight sort of psychological cognitive development standpoint, psychologists really mark 13 and younger as being very, very concrete in their thinking. That they're like, no, I saw it, it looks good, and I want it. And it's hard for them to think beyond that position. Once kids get to about 14, 15, they are able to get more distance on things, be more kind of healthily skeptical of what they're being sold and why. So as we think about what Cara said in terms of, your conversations change, your rules are going to change. A big part of that is because your kid's ability to think about these things is going to change pretty dramatically in the course of normal development. So the challenge with an 11-year-old is they're still quite concrete. Doesn't matter how smart they are. They are going to really think in that way of, I don't know, it looks good to me, I would like it too. All the same, you should start the conversation about how that is the result of a manipulation. One of the things that is really cool about teenagers and 11-year-olds are adolescents, adolescence begins a lot earlier than people think, is that they don't like being manipulated by adults. They are very much driving towards autonomy. They are very much driving towards self-determination. And so if you can take that opportunity to say, tell me where you learned about this skincare routine and show me this thing about the eyelash extensions. And then if you can in that moment, help your daughter see that the reason all of this is being served up to her, and also served up to her repeatedly, right, over and over and over again. So creating this norm where it feels like this is what she needs to have, is in the interest of someone making money. And usually the person making money is obviously TikTok, because the advertisers are paying them to keep your kid, this kid, engaged in these things and wanting to buy these products. So the more you can make it about an object lesson, a teachable moment, that her strong desire for these products has actually been engineered by the device that she is looking at, the more you can start to breathe some air into this conversation and say, I'm not saying you can't have, some nice face wash. And I'm not saying it's not fun to sometimes, get dressed up and play with makeup. What I'm saying is they're trying to get your money, and I want you to be aware of it and really start that conversation. And it may take a little time for that to really sink in, but it is never too early, especially if your kid's on social media. They are being played and they need to know it.
Hallelujah. It's so true.
All right, Cara, you ready for one? I got a great
I'm
one
ready.
from the audience. This is so big. We haven't even touched on it. I'm so glad we're going here. How do you spot disordered eating in boys? Do the signs differ from that of girls?
It's a huge question, and I want to reflect back to something that was said at the very beginning when the data was being presented, which is that while this is a conversation about data around girls, the conversation is not limited to girls. It is really about all genders. Obviously, we've talked about all genders on this during this hour. In my work, what I both love and find incredibly frustrating is that we have done such a fabulous job of giving girls and young women a microphone and helping them to articulate what's happening to them and see what's happening to them and talk about their body and talk about their feelings. We have not done as good a job doing the microphone handoff to boys. And so we don't tend to, as a society, hear what our boys are feeling or see what they're going through in quite the same way. And eating disorders is a perfect example. So eating disorders can be hard to spot in anyone of any gender, but particularly in boys, they tend to be described early on as getting fit or getting healthy. And then suddenly the pathological behaviors start to rear their head, and it's much later in the game than it is with girls who tend to, not always, want to lose weight. It's the issue for eating disorders and disordered behavior in general around food is even greater for kids on the gender spectrum. So I think it's really, really important to stop gendering eating issues and self-esteem issues entirely. Because when we look at the data, it really does show that 50% of eating disorders and body dysmorphia is male and 50% is female. And that's data that precedes looking at kids across the gender spectrum. Once we start consolidating all the data, what you're going to see is it hits everyone, and kids who are gender questioning even more. And so start getting granular, watching their behavior, asking them questions, checking in about how they feel, making sure that their eating habits seem not just healthy, right, but really, truly healthy and good for growth. And that's just the beginning of a very long conversation. For parents of boys, I encourage you to start reading about what conversations look like with girls around eating issues, and you can apply all the same rules to conversations with boys. Lisa, as always, we've gone a little bit over time with our chit chat, but I want to make sure to just take a minute before we wrap and talk about your new book. It's called The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. It is both a short, concise, accessible, and deeply profound read. And I've read it twice already. Do you want to just spend a moment and share a couple of top line, maybe tethered to this conversation, a couple of things that you get across in the book? And I hope everyone who's watching and listening will read it.
That's really kind. I really appreciate it. I wrote this book because of the adolescent mental health crisis and what it means to be post-pandemic with kids and trying to figure things out. I would say there's a couple things that I would really want people to take away, especially as they pertain to this conversation. One of the big topics on social media the kids are talking about a lot is mental health, and their conversations are not as accurate always as they should be. And I would say the general media conversations are not always as accurate as they should be about what mental health really is. And so my goal in writing this book was to just help parents who read it, adults who care about kids who read it, understand that for psychologists, we have never defined mental health in terms of feeling good or calm or relaxed or happy. We've always defined it in terms of having feelings that match the situation, even if those feelings are unpleasant or unwanted, and then handling those feelings well. For us, that's really the measure. Do you handle distress well? And so that's just to say, when kids are having their ups and downs, that is almost always typical adolescence. What we want to keep an eye out for are kids whose moods go to a concerning place and stay there, or kids who are relying on coping that is not actually good for them, whether they're abusing substances or being unkind to others or taking it out on themselves, or, and this is a place where social media comes right back in, some distraction can actually be very good at helping us maintain a sense of emotional equilibrium. But if a kid is spending hours and hours scrolling so as not to think about their feelings, then you want to keep an eye on that and get some help. So that's just a quick and dirty on some of the key thinking behind the book. Cara, I want to do a couple quick questions for you, just super practical before we wrap up, because our goal is just to leave people with as much absolutely, actionable advice as possible. So I got a couple for you. First, you mentioned social comparison a couple times. Say a little bit more about what exactly parents should be looking for and when it's time to worry about. We're talking about girls in particular here in this hour. We let off with them. What should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so social comparison is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's comparing yourself to others. In the olden days, when we were growing up, it was in real life social comparison. And today, that happens too, but it also happens across these social media platforms that we've been talking about. And sometimes social comparison, there are plenty of examples where it can be positive, sort of like positive peer pressure, right? It's not always a negative term, but I think in the context of your question, Lisa, what you're asking about is when it goes negative and when it impacts self-esteem. So when you start hearing a child, a tween or a teen using sort of self-demeaning or self-abusive language, they hate how they look, they're tearing apart every feature on them. These are flags. These are flags that there is probably some toxic social comparison. Start drilling down. Listen to them. Ask them why they think that, where they might have gotten those ideas. Start sitting down and getting informed about why they feel the way they feel. The world delivers a lot of different reasons to them for why they should feel that way. Oftentimes, kids need help, and it can be parental help, but it can also end up being mental health help that makes all the difference in the world in terms of social comparison.
All right, one more.
Okay.
If you could say one thing that you would want parents to focus on, as they are raising tweens and teens, what would be the one thing you would say, focus on this and the rest will follow?
Listening.
Yeah.
To me, you can't start a conversation without listening to what they have to say. Otherwise, it's a lecture. So if there's one nugget to take away from all of this, and I think it really sums up the research quite beautifully too, is Common Sense is out there listening. They're trying to get the answers from kids and share those answers with the adult audience. You and I, for a living, we listen. We can all do better. Put down your device, be in the moment, listen to what your kids have to say. You might be very entertained. You're probably going to learn some new language, and you will get to the bottom of what's going on with them, good or bad.
I love it. Cara, thank you.
Thank you. I am going to toss back to Lisa Solomon from Common Sense. Thank you, Lisa and Lisa.
Thank you so much. Lisa, I think you might be muted. Is that?
Yes, it's one of those days. A big thank you to Cara, Lisa, and Supreet. And Cara, we're looking forward to your upcoming book as well, so stay tuned for that. I just want to thank you all for your time and your expertise. And I want to thank all of you out there watching, either live or recorded. This has been a lot to take in, so I always just suggest everyone take a deep breath and also parse out this great advice in pieces. I learned the hard way, when you go home and brain dump everything on your kids, they might hear maybe 15 seconds. So kind of think through. You can always go back and rewatch because we will send a link to this recording. It is always our goal that you come away with at least 2 or 3 tips you can try right away at home. So I hope you got that out of today's really interesting conversation. I also really encourage you to check out Common Sense's resources. We put a lot in the chat as you work through the challenges of raising kids in today's connected world. And please consider signing up for Common Sense's free newsletter. It's easy to do at commonsensemedia.org/newsletters. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great evening.